My wife just comes in, she wants to ask me something.
No.
Kira, please come here.
Why? What's that?
I'm going to talk today about my life in China. That's also, of course, about my life. It's a chair on wheels. Hi, my name is René Gores, and I'm going to share today with you a few of my experiences with living and working in China and living and working in the West. Well, let's first start with offering myself a cup of tea. I'm in between my clients, and my clients just finished. I'm going to have a break, and after that I'm going to give some class, some Tai Chi class, and very soon I'm going to start the online classes so that you can follow these classes also online and partake through our what do you call it, a Zoom account, so they can see you at work when you are practicing, and they can help you with doing corrections in case there's several people in the class. On the Patreon account you will find the link towards these classes. It's a 35 category. You have access to all the online classes for the weekly program, and it will be for starters between 3 and 5 different classes. My wife just comes in, she wants to ask me something.
No.
Kira, please come here.
Why? What's that?
I'm going to talk today about my life in China. That's also, of course, about my life. It's a chair on wheels. So, I'm now talking about my private experiences. I'm going to talk to you about living and working in China, and what it actually did for me, and how it helped me, but also what is the main difference. And what I also experience when Chinese people want to come live in the West, and what they experience as a difficulty as a result of the differences in culture. And I'm not talking about the culture because things mean different things. I'm talking specifically about practical things in life. There's of course many Westerners in China who have found a job there, or they live there for whatever kind of reason, and most of them, they live in the top 1 cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Beijing. They live there because this is the place where there's most jobs for foreigners, although there's also jobs in factories and companies in the center of the country. China, of course, is huge. It's as huge as Europe, so you can imagine how big it is. It is about the same size as the United States also. So these are all very large countries, and there's, of course, many people living there. So there's also a lot of job opportunities. But when you go to work there, almost everybody expects you to either bring technical information, technical knowledge to China, and to to bring foreign languages to China, because many people, they find a job there as an English teacher, preferably native speaker, but also non-native speakers can find very good jobs, especially in smaller communities. The prices are not very high. You can see several posts also on YouTube and other places where you can see how people experience their life as a result of that. And in finance there's a large amount of jobs, but there's a lot of things that Chinese consider Chinese, and you're not welcome in these kind of jobs. And like in my case, I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner. I used to work in a hospital in Beijing, and I was accepted there also in meetings that were being kept there, being held there with the Chinese medicine government, and I was welcomed there because I'm also a Taoist. When I would come as a Taoist and I would be dressed in my Taoist clothing, they would accept me in the meetings because I would be there in the Chinese profession. But if I would come in my regular suit or my regular normal streetwear, they would not accept me, and I would say, like, what does the foreigner do here? And that has to do with the way how people look in China to us foreigners. They're not unaccepting towards foreigners, but they have a limited acceptance of what they think you as a foreigner can understand or not understand. This has partly to do with their history, where they feel that they have been wronged by Western powers, Western people, and we are very good with that. You ask the Native Americans, you ask the Aborigines, you ask the Africans. We have been wronging a lot of people. Muslims the same, they have been wronging a lot of people. So as a whole, historically, we are not part of the popular guys. We are feared and we are despised in many cases. And that's just a result of the way how we used to treat and how we still often treat other countries. So as a result of that, I was welcome in these meetings and hear all kind of things that were meant for Chinese ears, because I would come in the form of a Taoist profession, which is clearly recognized as something where you are part of the country. At the moment when you become an official Taoist, you do make an oath, and you're supposed to also swear an oath of allegiance to the Chinese government. You can take it in many ways, but that's basically what they intend you to do, because that's what the Chinese government asks you to do. You cannot become member of a school, a Kung Fu school for instance, or a Chinese medicine school even, without making an oath or something like this, or putting your signature something where you guarantee that allegiance. Then there's also, like for instance, the education system in China. You're not free to learn whatever you want. Everything is being set, and a large part of this learning is what we would call indoctrination. And it's the same what our advertisement companies do. They tell you all the time how wonderful they are. And this is basically it. You just have to live with that. And whatever kind of school you go to in China, this is just part of the learning process. And the part of the learning process of Westerners is to close your ears at that moment and just allow it to happen, because it's boring for us Westerners. And they don't mean anything bad with it. It's just their way of managing their country. And you cannot blame it. When you look at our propaganda about ourselves, we are not so very much different, except that we mention that other people do it in a way which is bad, and we do it in a way that is good. Finding a job outside the regular professions that I just pointed out was very difficult. For instance, I could find a job as a doctor. What do you want, sweetie? Yeah. I'm at this moment talking to my guest here on the video.
Hi.
Wil je ook wat zeggen? Ja, zeg ook maar. Hallo, zeg maar gast.
Hello.
Hallo. Yes.
Who are you?
Who are you?
What is your name?
What is your name?
Palas.
Oh, you are Palas. Okay, good.
你叫什么名字啊？
我叫 Palas.
What your Palas? Okay, great. Living there, actually, society itself tried to control you by pushing you into certain kind of professions because you're categorized as a foreigner. And the Chinese assume that you don't understand Chinese culture, and it might actually be true, because Chinese culture at this moment is very un-Chinese. So if you think you understand something about Chinese culture because of studying of history, that doesn't mean that you understand modern Chinese culture. And if you understand modern Chinese culture, actually you don't understand anything about historical Chinese culture. Modern Chinese culture is a sinified version of the West. Yeah, don't think about anything else, except that they kept the core of their old religion and their old institutions and their old bureaucratic institutions. For instance, the Chinese, they have Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and they have shamanism, and they have all kind of other local and translocal religions and spiritual groups and stuff like this, interest groups. But their primary worship is of power. If somebody has power, that he gets that by being really evil or by really being really good. And the first time you really read about how that works is in the Huainan Zi from Liu An in the Han Dynasty. And this is an encyclopedia in which in the old style of the Encyclopedia Britannica, you can say, with articles that explain particular aspects. And one of the things that it explains is that by doing good, you accumulate a particular kind of power, and this power makes other people resonate with you and follow you. And other people, through doing persistent evil, they create a particular kind of power, and that makes people of a like-minded nature follow you. And so like-minded people, they follow evil people, or they follow good people. And the evil people are only a few. And the good people also only a few. And the ones who are a little bit in between are like 90%. there's no percentage in the book, but you can say this is like 90%. And at the moment when you talk about it like a 90%, you talk about like you're indifferent or undifferentiated towards goodness or badness. And the whole point of spiritual training and religious training in the Chinese culture is basically to make you choose between one of the two so that everything becomes clear. You see it in the yin-yang theory. The yin-yang theory, everybody thinks like it's about the yin and the yang. No, it's not about the yin and the yang. It's about the division between yin and yang. And actually, you see in the diagrams in the Daoland, you see that the yin and the yang, the S-shaped division actually is very large, and the yin and the yang actually are very small, because the yin and the yang are radical and they polarize towards each other in that sense. But the things of importance, they happen in between. They happen at the separation. And like for instance, when you practice Tai Chi Kung Fu, you put somebody who is basically in the middle into a situation where he becomes either yin or yang, and as a result of that you can beat him. That's Tai Chi Chuan. So Chinese culture, they try to get you there. And like for instance, one time I was accepted on my name and on my reputation in China to work for a hospital in Tianjin. This was a political party hospital where a lot of party heads, after they retire, they go to be taken care of. And when I came there, they found out I was not Chinese. Of course, I was as a Taoist. I was coming there, but they recognized I was not a Taoist, not a Chinese. I was maybe a Taoist, maybe good in my work because I had all the qualifications. But the problem was that I was a Westerner, and they said, how will a Chinese person accept you as a Westerner to practice this profession? No Chinese will ever accept a Westerner doing these kind of things, for the simple reason that you can't understand our culture. On which my answer was like, okay, so you wear a Western medical coat, you wear in a Western, you work in a Western style building, you wear a Western style watch, you drive in a Western style car, you write with a Western style pen, and your notebooks and your computers, everything is Western style. So how much Chinese are you actually? Of course, this was our last conversation, you understand this, but it was my Taoist answer. It's the best way you can answer with a rejection is by saying, okay, what is your rejection based on? Instead of saying yes or no, because the rejection already happened. There was nothing very much to do. I couldn't save that kind of job even if I was a genius, and I'm not a genius. So that is just to be short about these kind of things. This is something that is very peculiar for Chinese, and when you're living in one of the professions that the Chinese government wants you to perform there, to bring in knowledge, to bring in money, and to help China forward in that strive to become the #1 country in the world, then at that moment you are welcome, and you don't notice where is the borderland between things. Some people notice, like for instance, there was a scandal in Shanghai when I was living there 5 years ago, where some few thousand Westerners, they were being evicted from Shanghai and from China because they were swapping notebooks with which girls and which addresses and telephone numbers and Weixin, WeChat addresses they could exchange just to date for quick sex, and well, all kind of other things, services which were actually not wanted by the Chinese government. In the same way, in Beijing, I come across when I was friends with a group of people in the center of the city of Beijing when I was studying at Baiyuan, and there were some black shirts. They were coming, and they were saying like to the girls, like, why are you there with this white guy? Because you are a Chinese girl. You're supposed to be with a Chinese man and not with a foreign man. They were not my dates. So they were not my girlfriends or anything like that. They were just very good friends, and I was interested in them because I was researching their work, and their work was actually on the borderland between how foreigners and how Chinese interact with each other, and what basically Chinese workers expect from foreigners, how they also prey on foreigners for all kind of reasons by intervening in the way how they rent a house, and they set up all kind of shady agencies to make money at the expense of foreigners, through which foreigners actually pay a lot for something that for Chinese would cost only 1/10 of the price. This is just something that happens everywhere in China, and everybody who has been in China has noticed that they have to pay more than the Chinese, and there is a law actually it should pay 2 times more than the Chinese, but in reality it's mostly 10 times more. It's just part of the trade mentality of China, I guess. Saying this thing makes it very difficult to actually develop yourself in a kind of profession that you would choose for yourself when you are living in your own country. But at the moment, when you are returning here, you notice like there's a lot of freedoms here, but also so many freedoms that at a certain point a lot of things don't make sense anymore. You can say you can be so free in how you express yourself that it becomes meaningless. While on the other hand, if you express yourself in a country like China, it actually immediately becomes meaningful because people know you can't talk about these things. For instance, there is no political humor in China. There's a lot of jokes, and if there's political humor, it's about foreign politicians. It's never, or almost never, about Chinese politicians. And well, there's a lot of other things. There's no, like here we can make jokes and we can really criticize a person through our jokes. And in China, this is basically a no-go. So when you make a Dutch or an American or an English-style joke to a Chinese, they will usually have a hard time understanding what is actually funny about your joke, because they have not been trained in that sense of humor. So this is actually when you live there for a long time and you live with all these restrictions and you know your phone is being tapped all the time and you're being followed sometimes, then you come to accept it as normal, and you know that it's the same for every Chinese, basically. And it's part of the normal things of life, so you learn how to sanitize your language and your behavior and so forth and so forth. It's not necessarily bad, it's just that the Chinese government expects you to always be innocent of a crime by preventing the crime. And here you're only guilty when the crime has been proven. So it's a very different assumption. People talk very often about human rights, and we say everybody has human rights, but in China, because of historical culture, basically you first have to prove that you're human. When you're born, you're not born as a human, you're born as, as a child is more close to being a demon than do anything else. And as a result of growing up and the education you go through, you either become good or evil, and the good people, they are more human than the evil people. That's just a matter of assumption. So at the moment when you are a human, you have human rights. So the human rights are there, but you first have to earn them. I think in Western law, people could do a lot with these kind of visions in revising law books and stuff like this. I don't know if that's necessarily good, but it is like that. So when you come back, you realize like, okay, actually some things are way more easy, and it's also I lived for 18 years half-time in China, and when I was in the Netherlands or when I was in other European countries or in America to teach or to give lectures, you don't really get to see very much of the local culture anymore. So I really noticed at a certain point when I was back that I'm really out of it. I didn't know my way anymore in my hometown Amsterdam, and I had to resettle. So it was like migrating to a different area. And it's not arrogance to say that. It's just that at a certain point you get used to a particular kind of lifestyle, particular kind of environment, and so on and so forth. And then now I see with friends who try to immigrate towards Europe for whatever kind of reasons. There's a way how we do things here, which is impossible in China. For instance, the law is the law in China. You can buy people off, or you can buy yourself into particular kind of things through red envelopes. This is all possible, or by becoming good friends and build a guanxi, social structure with people. Basically the rules are fixed. Most people, guanxi is not available for most people because they're not rich enough to actually make much sense out of that, except on a very small and local scale. But at the moment when they go here, they notice that if you want to arrange something in China, you want to migrate for instance, then everything is fixed. So you first make a plan, and then the plan goes like this, and you follow exactly that plan, just like when you have a TomTom on your in your car. But here things are flexible. That means that the law basically gives outlines with a certain kind of space around it, where options become possible because you happen to do them. So that means that your plan is more like generally instructional. There's not only a way from A to B which is straight, but there's also a way going zigzag or going all the way around it and then go back, for the simple reason that some roads are actually faster, and through your improvisation and through your adaptation you actually get there. That doesn't mean that the law cannot be very strict, but technically the law allows for deviation. And at the moment when a deviation goes a little bit too far, somebody might decide like, actually this is too far, this is not right. Like we have here in Holland, we have this politician, Mr. Wilders. I'm not a very big fan. He came up with some remarks about Moroccans that they had to leave the country. He hyped people to saying these kind of things, and he basically stretched the possibilities of free speech to the point where actually people said like, but that goes too far. And because of going too far, there came a court case, and this court case is actually already long time lasting, and it has to gradually decide if it is possible through free speech to make a remark at the disadvantage of other people in your country. That brings us also to the next thing. As a foreigner in China, I'm always a foreigner. I cannot register there as a permanent citizen. The government has the persistent right to evacuate me from the country if they see that's useful. I remember when the Olympic Games were playing, I happened to be in the mountains, and there was a letter for me that I had to leave in my email box, but instead of following that up, I went more deep into the mountains for the simple reason that the idea was that China doesn't allow more than a particular amount of foreigners in the country, because otherwise the country becomes too colored. It's a little bit similar like what happens in Japan, where it's possible to have their job as a foreigner, but you can't immigrate. And it's the same in Korea also. You can't really immigrate and have a permanent subsistence in China. Christopher Schipper, famous sinologist, he moved there because he had a Chinese wife. He took a library there and he wanted to use that as a foundation for his life and his work, to stay there until his death. But he eventually moved back because of the simple reason that it is actually administratively it's impossible. I cannot register in China even though I'm married to a Chinese wife. And there's another thing, your Chineseness is registered through Hukao on the place where you live, and as a result of that you're always registered there. It is not possible, or at least it's very difficult, to relocate from city A to city B. You lose your civil rights, your citizen rights, when you move to another place, which is something that you see happening with the Mai. There's the poor urban population that's moved into the big cities to do all the minor labor jobs, where in a country like mine, in the past, people from Arab countries and Eastern European countries were invited to do jobs that nobody else wants to do. As a result of doing these jobs, they can do these jobs, but they're not allowed to go to a hospital. Their children cannot go to school. There's all kinds of things that they can't have. They can't have any benefits. If there's any disease, they have to go back all the way to their hometown or home village, and then they have to look for healthcare over there. And even banks, contribute to that aspect. And me as a foreigner, I cannot get a hukao in China. That's the problem. You can register as a citizen. You have to register as a citizen when you come to live there, but you always remain a foreigner because of the simple reason you can't get a hukao. Hukao is like your family registry, and this family registry is very important. It stands on the home altar, and it says like, this is my family tree, basically. The hukao is the latest part from the family that is now at this moment alive, and some of the deceased people are there. And some families, they have a large tree with all the family members going back into the past, so that they know exactly who is their prime ancestor, who is the power of their family. There we go again. There's the power. We worship power. The Chinese worship power. So these are some of the big issues that you have when you live in China and when you want to live in China permanently. It's almost impossible to find the job that you want, except in a limited amount of jobs that are being permitted for you. And the second is you can't register in a place as being like belonging to that place. Like for instance, I can get a Taoist passport, but a Taoist passport is no national passport, so it doesn't give me any registry rights. Although it might be a step. I'm married to a Chinese woman, so through notary principle, I can in principle I can get onto this notary act, but it's a crime for the notary to put me on the act. So I also cannot get a Chinese passport. I don't know if I want one, but you know, there was a time when I was living and working in China when having a Chinese passport for being in China actually would have been very beneficial to me, and it's impossible. And that's where's the difference. When a Chinese person comes to the West, whether it's in America or it's in Europe, doesn't really matter. You come here and you can get a visa first. Then after the visa, your visa can become a green card and a permanent residence visa. And then from the permanent residence visa, you can get a European or a Dutch or a German or a French or an American passport. And at that moment, when you do that, you also have all the citizen rights that belong to that visa. And even when you have only your long-term visa permit, your residence permit, you already have a lot of rights which belong to people who also are born here. You don't have all the rights, but you have quite a lot of rights. In many countries, you can even actually vote on the local level, maybe not on the national level. I'm not exactly really sure about that, but that's something. Also, you can choose whatever job you want. You're expected to understand our culture, and you're not seen as an exemption because you're Chinese or because you're Japanese or anything like that. No, they consider that our culture is understandable. Every culture is understandable, but you have to live it. And the separation between Eastern and Western cultures is not so big anymore. Japan, Korea, China, they made an adaptation to Western culture already in the 19th century. They became Western countries, they became Western powers. They used Western political systems. In China, the government is structured in exactly the same way as the American government. They have exactly the same institutions, they just use them differently. They're not a two-party system, but a nine-party system. Nine-party system. Nine-party system, I wanted to say, so I get confused. Nine is Chinese nine. And at the moment, when you see this nine-party system, there is one major party which has almost all the seats, and there's 8 seats for the other parties, which are already pre-appointed. And that means they sit there with permission of the Chinese government. They are already accepted as being the leaders. Like for instance, one famous priest in Wudang, now at this moment is the head of the Taoist community in China. He sits in that government. So to go back to my Chinese family friends, they are trying to follow exactly the rules and regulations, while there is a particular kind of flexibility that's very confusing for them. In the Chinese culture, because of having the strict rules and regulations about how to do things, there's this kind of certainty. And the way of thinking of Chinese people is based upon that kind of certainty. You're married to a Chinese woman, or a Korean woman, or a Japanese woman, it's the same. There's a particular kind of expectation about what you need to do as a husband, or the other way around, if you're married with a Chinese husband. And there's a particular expectation about what you need to do as a wife. And you have to understand what it is. Your parents should have told you what that role is. You just have to do that, so you don't have to make agreements. Everybody knows exactly what a husband does, what a wife does, and as a result of that, it is possible to prevent a lot of conflict within families. Your marriage is a contract. Your love is a contract. The love is not a minor thing in your relationship, but it's not a romantic love. It's more like a respectful love. Which you have to develop, and the love that you have in a relationship is called the Qing'ai, azure love, and it means clear love also at the same time. Azure is the color of heaven, and that is the most pure color. It's same. You have like green tea. You have green tea, 绿茶, and you have green tea, 清茶, azure tea. So this is like that. And when you are in love with somebody, 恋爱, then at that moment you are basically assuming somebody in yourself. Basically, you're emulating that person. You're in love, and you become a little bit like that person. So everybody knows what it is when you are in love or when you are married. What is the difference? So for them, coming here is very difficult because the rules leave so much leniency that it's very difficult to not make up solutions as you go, because sometimes solutions are not exactly clear and the pathway you have to take is not exactly clear. And that's typical for the West. In that way, luck and bad luck, they can happen to you anytime. Like for instance, there is this regulation in the Netherlands that if you have an old place that you use for workplace or private living, and they find asbestos, then the owner of that place is supposed to take care of that. But when you are living in that house, then the rules are much more clear, because there's already so many confrontations before between people living there and house owners, that it is automatically that the owner has to pay for the expenses and have to reimburse for potential expenses. But in a company space, it is much more abstract. So that what I experienced with my clinic and my school is that I found asbestos, and the owner basically took my size by looking me in the eye and saying like, well, if you're going to protest my actions, I'm going to destroy your company. And he really tried, and he probably is going to keep on trying as long as he can. And he had all the means to do so. So it was very, very pricey, and the law has no offer for protection. Even though it says in the law that I am protected, there's no counteraction from the law by itself to actually protect me and to make sure that I don't have to carry all the expenses as a result of the damage done by the homeowner, by the shop owner, in that sense, the location owner from which I rented the place. So in China, that kind of things is automatic. The owner decides what happened to the place, whether you like it or not. Simple. Yeah, he wants to go out, you just go out. The whole idea that through a contract you actually have rights is actually quite new in China, and you noticed that recently in the press when a whole neighborhood was demolished because of the people living there were no longer welcome as part of the poorer parts of the city, and they wanted to make space for more expensive buildings in that place. I remember dating a girl for a while, and she was embarrassed to take me to her room, and then I found out that she was living in the basement of an apartment building, and her room was under the heating kettle, so it was nice and warm. So she said she was very happy with it. The floor was just covered with bags with her clothing and her ownership, and she slept on that every night. So this is where she lived. And going through the halls in these houses was very sad, because you see people in different states of poverty and disease and pain and misery, basically, coming from all kind of places, no education, no health care. And this is also part of the same Chinese society, which is very 19th century Dickensian. And I have been lucky to have been mostly in the upper part of that society through my contacts. But I remember when I meet my mentor in Beijing, he's a Dutch professor, he's dead already for a few years. And then he was living in a hotel, and he said, do you know what's happening next to your hotel? He didn't know, because he was always picked up by officials with large black cars and stuff like this. And he was like, oh, Beijing is marvelous, but he didn't see that part. So whenever you go live in a city in China, one of the tasks that you have to do to really notice what is China is go walk everywhere. Don't take taxis, just go walk and look what's happening between the cracks. But also do that in your own area. You see there's a lot of things going wrong on a smaller and a larger scale in your own country too. And as a result of seeing these things, you develop the right kind of mind to become an activist in your life and to try to work on bettering the world. because that's the only thing that is really, 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 really very important. And certainly in this kind of professions, what I do is you have to become an activist. If you're not an activist, you're basically trying to squeeze money from people, and you are busy with healthcare. And because of being busy with healthcare, you can't squeeze money from people. You have to make sure that you stay on the right side, so that you are no better off than the people that you have to help. You cannot choose only to help the people who have money, like most marketing companies. They try to convince you of, because that is just not right.